And he was talking about his experiences in the Gulf War, and it was pretty emotional. And somebody asked him the question, how do you lead in an environment like that? And he said, it doesn't matter what the environment is. He said, find good people, give them simple instructions, and let them get on with it. And that has resonated with me ever since. When I joined the APP, one of the things that I asked for was the ability to be able to bring in people who had experience and knowledge of working at major league sports level. I think it's our duty to apply those standards to the pros and to the amateurs, and therefore to the content that we create around them, so that video that we put out, graphics we put out, written word that we put out, still photography that we put out, would be equally well used by an NFL team or an MLS team or an NBA team, a team that has decades of heritage and operates at the highest level possible in sport.
All right, so Tom, with your experience with global giants like Formula One and Red Bull, the opportunities are actually endless for you. However, you chose to be the chief marketing officer of the world's first pickleball tour. Why is that?
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about that. That's a great question. I wish I had the chance to pick where I wanted to go. Life is never quite that simple. But you're right. I've come from some very big entities out there on the kind of global sporting stage. And I've always been attracted, I think, particularly in the latter part of my career, to organizations that are a bit more scrappy, that have a kind of fighter mentality, that are perhaps in some ways startups, but really want to try and break out of wherever it is that they are and do something extraordinary. And I think pickleball itself presents an absolutely unique opportunity for anybody who's involved in this sport in any capacity, whether it's in my world of marketing and broadcast, or whether it's on the operational side or the competition side. Pickleball has obviously been around for decades. It's been around since the 60s, but it really kind of exploded into the public consciousness during lockdown. And there's lots of reasons why. We can go into those reasons if you want. I'm always interested to look at the kind of philosophical reasons why something like that has happened. But it really exploded. 48.3 million adult Americans have picked up a paddle at least once in the last 12 months, according to research that we carried out with YouGov. And you only have to ask friends and family to be able to corroborate that evidence. If you ask 5 people that what do you know about pickleball? I guarantee you one of them's going to say I play. A couple of them are going to say I've played recently or I'm going to play. There's always one who says I'm not interested in that. But if you take that, 20% of the US adult population have played the sport. So it's massive. It's absolutely enormous. It is a true mass participation sport that has exploded in the last 5 or 6 years. When does anybody involved in sport have an opportunity to help shape the future of a sport that has engaged that many millions of people? If golf was invented today and it could grow at the rate that pickleball has, and somebody came to you and says, there's this strange sport, which is pretty frustrating for most of the people that play it. You walk around a lot, you hit a small white ball, and then occasionally it goes where you want it to go. And a lot of people who play this thing are very angry half the time because it's not doing what they want it to do. But lots of people like playing it, and lots of people want to watch it. Do you want to be part of helping shape the future of that new sport? Well, that's what happened with pickleball. So the opportunity came along. It presented itself firstly in 2021 when I met Steve Kuhn and Brooks Wiley and Melly Price, the people who created Major League Pickleball. And I was really honored to have the opportunity to work with them in helping get MLP off the ground. And during that time, I was introduced to the folks at the APP because they had forged a partnership with MLP in its early days before things got a little political and a little chaotic, and was instantly impressed by the fact that the people at the APP who we were working with at the time were just good people. They had really strong ethics. They had a very good kind of moral grounding. And they had this philosophy about wanting to ensure that their love of pickleball was being translated in the events that they do to every single player. And they had this fundamental belief, fueled by Ken Herman. You obviously know Ken, you've had him on your show. Ken has this absolute belief that people who compete in pickleball tournaments that the APP runs should be experiencing the same fantastic atmosphere and the same fantastic experience at every single tournament, from a first-time low-ranked amateur player right up to the best players in the world who are competing at pro level. So when given the opportunity to help shape this massive sport and be part of a group of people who are good people, how on earth could I turn that down?
With that being said, moving forward, what is the mission of the Association of Pickleball Players?
To answer the question, what is the mission of the Association of Pickleball Players, I'm going to go back a little bit to 2019.
Okay.
Ken Herman was the founder of the first ever pickleball tour. He was the first person to put his money where his mouth is. And he started organizing tournaments for pros and amateurs. Very quickly found himself, with a nationwide tour with hundreds of people competing at every single tournament. And he had created something called the Association of Pickleball Professionals. And there's lots of good reasons why he did that. And that model was quickly copied by others, some others who have continued to focus on the pro game. But after Ken had joined forces with Intersport, the Chicago-based sports marketing company, which became a majority owner of the APP, there were a group of us who were talking about where do we want this to go in future. And the game, while it is played at the highest level by some supremely talented athletes who are professional players who are making a good living out of the sport now, its growth and its popularity is really driven by amateur players. The millions of people who are playing the sport across the USA and now increasingly worldwide, many of them are recreational players. Many of them are players who have no interest in the pro game. And some of the data bears that out. There's a couple of percentage points of players who play pickleball regularly who can name more than one pro player. The awareness of pro players amongst the general broad mass of players is very, very low. And again, we can go into why that is. But pickleball is really being driven by recreational players. At the top of the kind of recreational player pyramid, there are a group of players who are engaged in tournament play. And that could be as large a number as 100,000 players in the US. But that is dwarfed in comparison with the number of people who are playing regularly in facilities around the country. So we took a decision to change the name of our organization to the Association of Pickleball Players, specifically so that we could better represent players of all abilities. And when you come to an APP event, whether it's an APP tour event that's televised nationally and internationally, that has thousands of people competing, hundreds of people involved in running the event, you will see that there are players of all ages and all abilities who are having a fantastic time at our events. We do obviously a lot of research into how people feel about our tournaments. And you only have to go on social media after an APP event to see how positively people feel about our events. There is an army of people out there who, frankly, kind of do a fantastic ambassadorial job for us by telling the people the APP is the best in the business at running a tournament. So we're doing a great job of representing players who are involved in the tournament world. And increasingly, what we're starting to do is engage players who are perhaps not involved in tournaments, but want to be part of a tribe. And I'm going to get a little bit kind of pseudo marketing science here. A very, very clever person who he lives in Salt Lake City, runs an agency up there, told me a few years ago about Maslow's hierarchy of principles. This idea that this philosophical belief and understanding that people just want to be part of a community. Ultimately, what we're driven by is wanting to be surrounded by people who share our beliefs and who kind of lift us up. It's why Coca-Cola wanted to teach the world to sing. Coca-Cola don't sell soft drinks. Coca-Cola sell friendship and family. That's why Coca-Cola products have names on them, because you can give the bottle of Coca-Cola to somebody and demonstrate that you are part of their kind of family group. Yes, they sell soft drinks, but from a branding perspective, they sell family and friendship. That is rooted in Maslow's hierarchy of principles. Pickleball is a community that is driven by fun and social interaction. 76% of all people who play pickleball tell us in our research that the reason they play this sport is to have fun. And one of the missions for us, and this is more of a kind of brand marketing mission for me, I guess, is how can we create opportunities for pickleball players to identify themselves to each other as part of a tribe? If I walk down the street as an English person and as a Manchester United fan, if I walk down the street in Austin, Texas, where I live, wearing a Man United jersey, and I see somebody walking towards me wearing a Chelsea jersey, there is a kind of, a nod to each other, because we're both what you would call soccer, what I would call football fans. We're part of a tribe. Now, we have an intense rivalry between each other because their football team is not as good as mine, despite current form. But ultimately, we belong to a tribe. You go to a concert and you're surrounded by people who are engaged in exactly the same experience as you are. And your whole experience of that event is lifted up because you're part of a bigger group. And pickleball needs that. Pickleball needs a unifying identity that gives somebody who is, in very kind of, basic terms, walking down the street, the opportunity to see somebody walking towards them and say, oh, you're a pickleball player. Currently, there is no way of doing that. But the APP has the opportunity to be able to do that. That takes a lot of work. It takes a long time. It takes real, honest, authentic engagement and relationships with players of all abilities. And it takes a focus on players overall, not just one specific sector. So I think that's a marketing speak, but what is our mission? Our mission is to elevate players of all ages and abilities and create the best opportunities for them to play the sport that they love. That is a really kind of overly simplistic way of summarizing what we try and do. And it's rooted in positivity. It's rooted in inclusivity rather than exclusivity. And it's rooted in a belief that pickleball is fueled by something really great, which is fun.
This is so interesting. So if you're breaking this down into like pillars for developing a tribe, what are you looking at to actually create this tribe within the APP?
So that's a very good way of asking that question, because it kind of gets into what is your strategy. If you think about, I'll answer that in content terms, because that is a kind of, again, a slightly oversimplistic way, but it is a way of being able to describe what we do. At the top of our game are pro players, the best in the world. The players who compete in the APP tour are regularly competing, at an incredibly high level on national and internationally televised events, and they can hold their own against pretty much anybody in the world. The viewer of pickleball on TV can't really differentiate between one player or another. What they're tuning in to see is great action, great sport. So one of the pillars that we are focused on is how do we elevate the pro game? The APP leads the way in TV production. We were the first to introduce virtual court logos. We've been the first to introduce enhanced graphics. We've been the first to introduce things like instant replay that is used in competition. We really are extremely lucky that our partnership with Intersport gives us access to some of the best TV producers, frankly, in the world in sports terms. These are people who work with the Final Four, they work with NFL, they work with the PGA. These are people who are working at the highest possible level of TV production. And those skills are applied to our pro game. So we set the standard. That is also then mirrored in the team that I have the privilege of working with every day, in the marketing team. We have, frankly, the best videographers. We have the best photographers. We have really smart, the best social media people. I have an amazing person on my team who works in earned media and PR. We have a graphic designer, just one, who is pushing up everything that we do, who is head and shoulders above anybody else in the pickleball world. She is an absolute diamond. I have website people, I have editorial, I have a whole group of people who are frankly the best in the business. And they're very focused on elevating the pro game, because that is of great interest to pickleball players. But it is not only what pickleball players are interested in. So what we do is we put content out into the pickleball world that showcases the pros at the very top of the game. And then increasingly, we're starting to put more and more bits of content around that pro action that showcases how pickleball is positively affecting people's lives, because that is what is relevant to the general consumer. So what you will see from the APP as we continue to grow and develop are an increasing introduction of pillars that talk more about why people like pickleball overall. Pro action is part of that, and it will always be a really critical part of our organization. It's why we've expanded our live streaming at our tournaments up to 4 days for every tournament now. It's why we have the biggest ever TV deals that we've done. We have hours and hours of national linear broadcast for our events. And it's why we invest so much in such talented people on the marketing side to be able to create great content, world-class content that leads the way in pickleball. But increasingly what you're going to see is the introduction of more and more pillars that give us an opportunity to engage with players in the way that they engage with content. And as we all do, we're all sitting there on a phone or on a screen, scrolling through stuff. If all you see is pro as a pickleball player, after a while, you're going to start tuning out. If as a pickleball player, you're seeing pro, and then you're seeing something which showcases, somebody whose life has been positively affected by the game, or you're seeing something which is a tip and a trick, is kind of, here's how to improve your game. What you're going to start seeing is this is all coming from one source. This is coming from an organization that represents all players. And that is how you build that tribe. That is how you build that community. It had to start with the pro game, because that is right at the top of what we do. But as we continue to expand and develop, both in the US and internationally, you will see more and more introduction of more and more content pillars that will have authentic representation of why people are playing pickleball and what they love about the sport. And that is how we will create that tribal identity. Ultimately, it'll be expressed in some tactical things like you're wearing a cap. You're wearing a cap that identifies your podcast and what you're doing and your whole mission. You'll see people wearing APP products, because that'll be the thing that identifies them as a pickleball player. And that's really kind of what we're working towards.
So there's a question that I have that I didn't know we were going to get to. I thought we were going to jump right to our next one, but this is perfect. So I think a lot of our audience listening, including myself, is seeing a gap here. And that's kind of what you're getting to, is like, how are we going to close the gap? Do you mind sharing with us, with those partnerships, what average viewership may look like right now on a APP or any other broadcast?
Yeah, I can share some of those numbers with you. The first thing I would say is we have very, very good relationships with some of the most famous sports broadcast names in the world: ESPN, CBS Sports Network, Fox, and others. And what the executives at those organizations tell us is that the viewers that are tuning in to watch pickleball on their channels don't differentiate between whichever organization is putting pickleball on. What they differentiate is the quality of the production that is on that channel. So the viewer is tuning into CBS Sports Network expecting to see something that is produced at exactly the same quality as they've just been watching an NBA game or an NFL game or an NHL game. And that's why we invest so heavily in TV production and use the best there are, so that we are meeting the expectations of sports fans who are tuning in to watch linear broadcasts. There have been some, frankly, wild claims made about audience numbers for some pickleball events. I have access to the real audience data for those tournaments and those kind of events. And it is, I think, slightly disingenuous, perhaps that's a polite way of putting it, to make such wild claims about audience numbers. There are some facts about the sports broadcast world that people inside the world know to be true. If you put certain programs on certain channels at certain times, you're going to have a decent audience, no matter what you put on. You could put on a feature about somebody running down the street, and you're going to get an audience that is going to watch that because the audience has that channel on in their house anyway. So when people are making claims about hundreds of millions of people, and impressions and the kind of massive potential reach of programs and content, I think it's disingenuous, and I actually think it's damaging to the sport, because ultimately what it's doing is it's setting unrealistic expectations, which sponsors know about. They are very aware when they are being told the truth or when they're being perhaps misled. So I can tell you, if you're on ESPN, for example, on a midweek evening slot, you can be expecting to get about 200 to 250,000 people tuning in to watch a show like that. If you're on CBS Sports Network, you're getting a multiple probably around that for certain times of the day. It depends what hours you go into. It also depends what's gone before and what's gone after. But our viewing figures are directly comparable to everybody else who is putting national broadcasts out there. And we share those numbers very openly and honestly with our sponsors, because we have to. They have independent media people who are looking at those broadcasts too and giving them the real data. So there's no point trying to hide it or make up numbers or inflate numbers to suggest that you're perhaps more successful than you are. I think the other thing that's important to note is the viewing audience is now very, very different to how it was even 5 years ago. The viewer is using multiple screens to watch events. So they're tuning into live streams, and we're getting thousands of people tuning in to watch our live stream. They're watching that across multiple different platforms. And they're also engaged with conversations about the sport through things like X or things like Facebook or Instagram. So there is a kind of fragmented audience out there that is engaged with your programming at all times. But the key here really is about how do we attract people who are not pickleball fans to tune into pickleball when it is on traditional linear networks, because that is where some of the growth of the sport is going to come from. And I think that we have to be honest about what that real audience looks like. When you make comparisons based on viewing figures with other sports, for example, and you say we've done better than another sport, it is disingenuous, because the reality is that our audience is probably going to be there whatever sport is on. That audience has not deliberately tuned in to watch that show because they've been sitting there patiently waiting for pickleball to start. Sure, some of them are. And we need to focus on making sure that more and more of those people do. But again, this is why it's absolutely critical that you invest in world-class content that amplifies what you're doing on the linear program and on your live stream across all of the social media channels available to you, that you're using email really well, that you are using PR, old school earned media, and that you're investing in that. But also so that you're talking authoritatively and honestly to the amateur players who are not featured on the TV show. And by disregarding them and by pushing them out and making them feel excluded, you are, frankly, you're cutting off your audience growth very aggressively. So that's why we have such a focus on making sure that everybody who kind of interacts with our world feels like they leave with a really positive experience.
So if I were to summarize this and this gap closure between the viewing numbers and that 43.8 million that have picked up a paddle in the past 12 months, you would first allude to building a tribe, right, around your brand. Really what is also identified as like creating almost like raving fans. I don't know if you ever read that book, but definitely a great reference. The second piece being, as you just mentioned, involving people that aren't necessarily playing pickleball consistently, but becoming aware of it. And then thirdly, keeping that like high level production consistent. Yeah. Are those really like...
You have to keep the high level production. You have to keep elevating that because sport generally is doing that. You know, I'm a Formula One fan, and I've had the privilege of working in it. Every time I tune into a Formula One Grand Prix now, I'm seeing more and more better use of graphics. I'm seeing better use of cameras. The viewer expects you to keep elevating. It expects you to keep improving. We have the best talent in the business on our TV shows. We have a stable of 3 announcers and analysts, Dom, Chad, and Dorian, who really would grace any pro sports. They are spending an awful lot of time improving their own skills and learning how to be better broadcasters, not just pickleball broadcasters. So that's just one tiny aspect of how you elevate the production. But you're right. I mean, it is about, ultimately for me as a marketing person, it's about trying to build this tribe. And high production values are a part of that. Creating more and more kind of ways of showcasing why people love this sport and how they engage with it is another part of it. The other thing I would say is being realistic about where your growth will come from. The analogy that I often use is running. You think about how many people run every single day. There are millions of people in the US alone who run around the neighborhood or on a treadmill at home, or they go to a gym and they're running on a treadmill. You know, when I go and stay in a hotel, usually the treadmills are full because people, don't know the neighborhood, perhaps if they're staying in a hotel, and they just want to run. Ask a runner, your average runner, to name 5 professional runners, and I can guarantee you that they will say at least 2 Olympians. They'll say Usain Bolt, they'll say Flojo, they will say Carl Lewis, and that's probably where they're going to start running out of names. The reason they know those names is because they're Olympic heroes. These are people who have been elevated from their sport by the Olympic platform. And I think pickleball is very similar in a way. Millions of people play pickleball just like millions of people go running. Ask your average pickleball player to name pros, and they're going to struggle to do that. The numbers tell us that. The data tells us that. So it's partly my job to elevate those pros and to keep creating opportunities to showcase them to the best of our abilities. And that is through investment in TV and in social and in all the other kind of content platforms that are available to us. But it's also being realistic about it. If you can harness all of those runners, you can find a way of badging them in a kind of horribly marketing speak, then you're tapping into the tribal piece of that. And that's expressed for me through bumper stickers. When I'm driving around and I see 13.1 or 26.2 on the back of a car,
you're right.
It's immediately, that person is a runner. And you don't even have to see them. I mean, you're driving behind them or driving up towards their car and you see that. you know that they're a runner. I've done one half marathon. My marathon, I'm never going to do a marathon. My half marathon days are way behind me. But I see that 13.1, and I know that person has been through the same thing that I've been through. So we have a kinship. We have an immediate connection. We're part of that same tribe. The bit that's missing from those bumper stickers is nobody has found a way of putting one brand in all of them. I'm always surprised that a Nike or a Brooks or anybody who is involved in running apparel or equipment hasn't found a way of being able to use something as simple as that to be able to kind of put their brand in as the preeminent tribe. But that is tribal at its most kind of pure form.
So really building off this, we've spoken a little bit about this, and I think you spoke on, I want to say it was Racket X, and I think the Dink too on the Pickle Pod a little bit about the APP being much more than just a tour. Can you really tell us how that is?
So there's a couple of elements to that. The first is the spirit of pure competition. So pros who compete in APP tour events are competing for points, which amass over the season to enable them to get into main draws, which enables them to win more and more prize money. So, to use a kind of game show tagline, points win prizes. That is why we've seen such rapid growth in the pro game in qualifiers for our events. It's why we've had to run previously like qualifiers for the hundreds of pros that want to try and get into the opportunity to get through into the main draw. And I think that is a really important core ethos of what sets the APP Tour apart. Our tagline for the tour is the world's first, the world's best, because we were the world's first, and again, copied, never improved, and the world's best because it is pure competition. There is no exhibition element to that. There is another model out there, which is some have dubbed the Harlem Globetrotters of pickleball, which has its place. The exhibition play definitely has its place. But when players are salaried and are tied to contracts, it reduces the spirit of competition. And even if you reduce that by 0.01%, you are taking away something that is an absolutely critical part of the growth of the game as a really, truly credible sport. It also raises quite a lot of other questions about governance and about independence and the way that rules and regulations are applied to players, if there are players who are better rewarded than others, for example. But we've seen examples in the middle of a match in other organizations when a player will literally just switch hands. They'll take the paddle out of their normal playing hand and put it in the other hand and play a couple of points for like that because it's fun. Well, that may be fun on TV and it might raise a smile, but that's not serious competition. Like, imagine Rory McIlroy midway through, the final round at the Masters, so kind of going, well, I've got a 4-shot lead. I don't think McIlroy's ever going to have a 4-shot lead at the Masters, but has he won the Masters? I don't know. You imagine him kind of halfway through his final round going like, oh, I'll tell you what, I'll now play a shot with my other hand. There would be uproar, and for very good reasons, because that's not what sport actually is about. Entertainment has its place, and it is a large part of it. But the APP Tour at the pro level is rooted in pure competition. And it's why players are drawn to us. It's why sponsors are drawn to us. It's why the TV networks like what we do. And it's why fans are drawn to us. And it really is where the sport's future has to go. The sport has Olympic aspirations, and I firmly believe it will become an Olympic sport. It's not that far away from fulfilling some of the base criteria to be able to achieve that. But the Olympics, you can't stop an Olympic gold medal match halfway through and kind of go, well, look, let's for a bit of fun, let's just switch hands of the paddle. It just wouldn't happen. So why would you say, well, that's one model, but we're going to do something else? As you're trying to grow a sport in credibility terms and in audience engagement terms. And it's why it's such an important part of what we do. And so the second thing is the amateur experience. we have a large percentage of our matches are refereed, which means that there is independent governance of matches that are taking place from the very lowest ranked amateurs right up to the highest ranked pros. We have people, independent officials from USA Pickleball, who are keeping an eye on every single match, so that there is objectivity in the way that competition takes place in our tournaments. If somebody spends money to come and compete in our events, hard-earned money, and they've decided to part with that, we have a duty of care and a respect for that person to provide them with the platform to be able to go and compete fairly and honestly. Right, as I say, right up from somebody who's never played a tournament before, up to the highest ranked pro. And then there's all the kind of little touches. There's the food and drink, and there's the availability of trainers, and the kind of general atmosphere that is created at an APP tournament that is rooted in inclusivity. And it's something that I've really always believed. It is the absolute opposite of my experience in Formula One. Formula One is an exclusive sport. To be able to get into the heart of Formula One, you need multiple passes. You're literally going through barriers that prevent you from getting into where the stars are. Well, in pickleball, it's the opposite. Pickleball is an inclusive sport. It is, gender equal, and it's absolutely fabulous that it is, because it leads the way. There's very few other sports that have true equality at their heart. Mixed doubles is probably the most entertaining form of pickleball, or perhaps it's the fans' favourite. What other sport can you say that about? That in itself is a great thing. So we celebrate that as much as we celebrate the experience for everybody who is part of our world. And I think that's what the APP is rooted in, is this sense of true, pure competition and inclusivity. That's how you build long-lasting relationships with players and with fans.
How about now under the APP umbrella, like the global pillar? So I know that's been something that you guys have been working with and through over the past couple of years, is really expanding the sport globally as like the first steps towards getting to the Olympics. So what have you done to really expand the APP globally into those markets?
So under Ken Herman's leadership, we've been very active on the international stage now for a number of years. So we've been helping run tournaments worldwide. The English Open is a perfect example of that. A tournament that 3 years ago had 400 players, 2 years ago had 800 players, and then last year had, I think, nearly 2,000, if not 2,000 players. As an English person, I'm very proud to see the rapid growth of the game there. We were the first on the ground in Australia, working with the folks out there to help them get up and running. And similarly in Sweden and in Spain. We've been very active in India and in China. We were the first to have an international broadcast deal with ESPN China, for example, so that we could show our action to the hundreds of millions of people out there. The international world of pickleball is a fascinating one, because the sport has been born and bred in the US, and it's had a very US focus. But obviously, as the rest of the world is catching up, it is seeing some really interesting developments in the way that federations and associations are kind of coming together. And there is a little bit of kind of, as you would expect, there is a little bit of kind of a jostling for space within the overall global framework. So we are very, very careful about how we conduct ourselves internationally, because we want to be extremely respectful of local needs and supporting those wherever we can. We're also extremely focused on making sure that we don't dictate to people what they should do. It is important that the world is able to embrace pickleball in the way that is relevant and right for them, without an organization like the APP betraying its inclusivity beliefs and going and saying, this is how you have to do it. I think it is also part of our relationship with USA Pickleball is an important part of this. USA Pickleball is joining forces with its counterparts worldwide, and that is critical in terms of achieving those Olympic aspirations. We can't be all things to all people, and we shouldn't be. There needs to be a clear division between governance, rules, and regulations, and the commercial side of the sport. You cannot have the two interacting with each other or being owned by the same entity, because there's an obvious conflict of interest at the heart of that, because it means you would be applying rules and regulations to suit preferred players or sponsors or whomever else is involved in your world. I mean, that's just a kind of basic common sense thing. So what are we doing? As I say, we've been very active worldwide for a number of years now with different countries. We are very active with USA Pickleball as they continue to look abroad and start to work with people internationally. And then at a really kind of tactical level, one of Ken's babies has been the US national team, the APP US national team that we have created. He has taken those players around the world. So for the last couple of years, we've been putting them all on a plane and sending them off to go and play in tournaments worldwide. That, in a way, that feels like a drop in the ocean, because you think about how much is going on in pickleball, and sending one team to go and compete in international tournaments feels like a kind of very small part of everything else that's going on. But it's an absolutely critical part, because you have to start somewhere. Being able to take young American players to go and compete in Australia, to go and compete in England, for example, to go and show the players in those countries what the standard is like at that world-class elite level in the US. That's important from an ambassadorial perspective, but also, frankly, just taking the time to go and meet people out there, go and forge relationships with them, go and share the love of the sport that was born and bred here. It makes that investment absolutely worth it. So there are no boundaries to social media. There is no boundaries to what pickleball can achieve. And again, the Association of Pickleball Players can represent players all over the world. So as we grow and develop, you will see more and more coming from us internationally.
Is there certain markets that you're targeting, that you're seeing the most growth in on your end? Like, what are those markets that are just exploding beyond the US?
So I mean, I'm biased because I'm English, but I mean, England really is the I would have said the kind of lead of this. There is, I've used this saying before, I think I used this on the Dink. There is a saying that when America sneezes, the world catches a cold.
Yes.
That has hugely negative connotations, but its fundamental meaning is accurate. Obviously the UK and the US have a very close relationship, and there's always been a kind of direct transfer of movies and entertainment and music and culture from the US to the UK. So it's kind of not really surprising that the UK has played such an important role in growing the sport. The UK finds it, and England in particular finds itself at an interesting point, because paddle is rapidly growing in Europe as well.
It is.
And while I don't think it's really mirroring the same growth rate that pickleball is in the US, there are an increasing number of paddle courts in throughout Europe. I believe, in particular, in Spain and in Sweden, and now I hear from friends and family back home in the UK. So pickleball in Europe kind of has what it doesn't have here in the US, which is direct competitor for attention. So the fact that the English Open has increased at the rate it has, in spite of the fact that there is another emerging racket sport which is fighting for the same people's attention, is testament to how, I think, far the game has come in that country. So I think England is a really important one. Australia is obviously important as well, but I think you cannot now ignore what's happening in India. Anybody that is unaware of how quickly the sport is developing in India, you only have to do a quick search on social to find out how many people are playing and who's being attracted over there. There are some really interesting opportunities being created for pro players in India. And that is obviously a vast untapped market in many ways. I think pickleball has this unique ability to be able to be played very easily in existing facilities. So anywhere where there's a tennis court, that can be converted to a pickleball court in a matter of minutes. It's not quite the same for paddle, which does require a slightly more infrastructure to be able to play the game. And please believe me, I'm not trying to denigrate paddle at all, because I think anything that puts a paddle or a racket in somebody's hand gets them out on a court so that they're getting fitter, getting healthier, and having a good time. That is a great thing. As they say, the kind of rising tide lifts all boats. But I think that selfishly, I think England is a really important part of the growth of the game internationally, because it will then trickle out into other parts of the world that England has relationships with. And I think India can be a fascinating kind of growth engine for the sport throughout Asia, because that will see it spread into Southeast Asia, into China, and into the Middle East from there.
Yeah, they just had, I want to say it's Global Sports League in India. They had, there's another one with, I think Pickleball World Rankings has their own league. So there's massive opportunity happening over there, which, to your point, for the players, and I think also for the growth of the sport as a whole, is like this whole new leg that's really going to push the sport forward, like aggressively, which is super cool to see, especially from an outsider looking in. So with that being said, the APP, what is that 10, 20-year goal? Because I kind of want to reverse engineer this a little bit, if you bear with me. So what's that 10, 20-year goal that the APP is really looking at?
I'll speak for myself rather than for the business, because I have the two views are somewhat aligned. But our goal obviously is to create a profitable, well-run, sustainable business that represents millions of people worldwide who play this amazing sport. We're well on the way to doing that. We've been very, very clever, I think, with our finances, and with our investments, with the way that we are using the money that is available to us. We've made some difficult decisions previously that have put us in a much better position than we had been in years past. We're in a much better position now to be able to kick on and achieve what we really want to achieve. From my perspective, where I would like us to be in 10 years' time, actually even sooner than that, is to represent those players that I talked about before. I would like to be able to go into my local supermarket and see somebody wearing an APP t-shirt or a cap or a hoodie or whatever, and to know that person is part of our tribe. It's happened to me now 5 or 6 times in the last few months. I've bumped into people in random places wearing t-shirts from tournaments that we've put on. And each time I go up and thank them for wearing the t-shirt, and they're always a little surprised that some random English person is coming up and bothering them and thanking them for wearing clothing. And that's just an anecdotal evidence. Obviously, the plural of anecdote is not data, but it's very, very kind of satisfying to me every time I see that, because it means that the work that we're doing is starting to pay off. So what I would like to be able to do is know that when I walk down the street, that I can identify somebody as a pickleball player because they're wearing an APP item of clothing. I will see that at tournaments. I will see that at pickleball venues and clubs. And that's a kind of cheat code. That's a way of kind of making yourself feel much better about the work that you're doing, because you're going right into the heart of the target market. So it's almost inevitable that you're going to see people wearing your branding there. There's a saying that my father taught me, which I probably shouldn't put out in public, but he calls it peeing in your wetsuit. It's a nice warm feeling for a few seconds, and then you get cold again. which is why I think what I would like to achieve is to be able to, walk down the street surrounded by just normal people and be able to identify somebody as a pickleball player because they are wearing the branding that we have created around them. To get to that point takes all the steps that I've talked about before. It means we've engaged millions of people with really great content and really great experiences that have given them a reason to say, I want to be part of that tribe. That's what represents me. So that's where I would like us to be.
So if we were to get into the weeds a little bit, because I 100% agree. Like when you start walking down the street and seeing your brand, it's kind of like that wow moment, right? That light bulb moment there. But if we're diving into the weeds and we're actually looking at the metrics that you guys are tracking in order to say we are making progress towards this goal, what are those metrics that you're actually identifying from like a business lens?
So there's a couple of really simple ones. One of them is about people signing up to play in our tournaments. We made the transition to registration for our events on UTR Sports relatively recently. UTR is, the world's leading player in tennis, in ratings and rankings and tournament management systems. And they have turned their attention to pickleball and are throwing an enormous amount of weight behind their investments into this sport. I know some people are confused a little bit about the difference between UTR and DUPA and all of the other bits and pieces that go into signing up for a tournament. But it becomes pretty simple pretty quickly once you start to kind of engage with it. I kind of liken it a little bit to like airline rewards programs. You buy a ticket to somewhere on Delta, and you get some airline rewards points. You buy a ticket on American, you have a similar kind of experience on the site. You just get a different kind of package of rewards. That's not a direct comparison because obviously those are rewards rather than ratings. But UTR are the best in the business in tennis, and it will only be a matter of time before they are the dominant player in pickleball. I've seen some interesting comments from some of their competitors, which are kind of trying to state their position now, which you would expect them to do, but it's part of it feels a little bit like they're kind of shouting rather too loudly at the moment, knowing what's coming. So UTR is a really important part of how we measure the success of our business. How many people are signing up for events is a key part of that. And we've seen thousands of people signing up for tournaments, APP tournaments on UTR. So that is a key measurement because it means people are going from through the kind of marketing funnel, they're going from awareness of our events and understanding of what those events are. They're responding to the call to action to sign up for the event. If they've already played an APP event through UTR and they have a UTR-P rating, then it's simple. They're already in the system and they know what they're doing. The really interesting piece is the person who's never gone through that process, and we get them from awareness through to signing up. Fast forward a year, the tens of thousands of people that will take part in APP events this year will be coming back next year for all the reasons that I've talked about before, because of positive experiences and great competition and all that kind of good stuff. So that is an important part of the mix. We also have the added benefit of a number of our events being USA Pickleball Golden Ticket tournaments. And, there are a couple of really big showcase events in the pickleball world every year, and USA Pickleball Nationals is one of those kind of real headline acts. So the knowledge that players can come and compete in several of our tournaments and win through to golden tickets, win through to nationals, is another important metric for us. We want to make sure that we are creating as many opportunities for people as possible to go and play with our partners at that tournament. So that's one piece of it. You could simply kind of put that as registrations. We're doing, it's probably not for me to say, we're doing very, very well with that. as I say, thousands of people are signing up for our events. And I think that's because there's an awful lot of brand loyalty, and there is perhaps there is some love of what we do, which I think a lot of that goes back to Ken Herman and a couple of other people in our team. A woman called Melissa McCurley, who runs our competition department. Melissa was the brains behind pickleballtournaments.com. There is nobody better at running a tournament in the world than Melissa. And she has a couple of people on her team, one called Nicole Hobson, and Dee Davison, and a couple of other people who are genuinely the best in the business. So when USA Pickleball wanted to kind of re-establish nationals last year, after some things that had happened the year before, they asked if we could work with them to help with that. And Melissa and her team went and ran nationals. Thousands of matches with thousands of players being run seamlessly. So registration's part of it. Obviously, fans attending our events is going to be an increasingly important part of what we do. We've been really focused on making sure that we create as many opportunities for players to come and compete as possible, because that's the kind of foundation, that's the kind of bedrock. But now we are starting to turn our attention to attracting more and more people to come and watch, and we're seeing a really good return on that. I was at the Fort in Fort Lauderdale, our new HQ down there in Florida, for the tournament that we ran in January, and you couldn't get a seat on Championship Court for all 4 days of pro action there, from the first ball that was hit to the last moment that somebody walked off the court. That was really pleasing to see. It was particularly pleasing. This is such a technical point. It was particularly pleasing to see non-players watching. So there were people there who were not wearing playing gear. They'd come in their normal clothes just to watch. And it's because they wanted to come and see this, the best out there competing on this great court. So we're putting increasing attention into that, and that's an important part of this too. And then a couple of others. One is sponsorship. Obviously, sponsorship is a very important part of our overall business. We are so lucky to have such fantastic partners. This week, we just announced an extension of our partnership with Humana. We have a new 5-year deal with them. They are really heavily embedded in our events. They are running a thing called the Humana Cup, which is for champions and masters players over 50 and over 60. And they have a great experience on site. And then we have other amazing partners like AARP, who have been really embedded in our organization now for the last couple of years, and are creating programs that attract more non-tournament players to come and compete and come and be part of our events. And then others like Zimmer Biomet, and The Botanist, and a whole bunch of other great sponsors that we have on board. So increasing sponsorship is a very important part of our growth. And that comes with the investment in production. It comes with the investment in more and bigger and better tournaments. And it comes with increasing attention on bringing non-playing fans to come and watch our events. So those are some of the key metrics that we have. I have one, which is obviously from a social media perspective. I want to increase our audiences, and we've got some really interesting ways that we're starting to deploy now of being able to achieve that. It's critical you do it organically. I look at some of what other people out there do, and there are people who are using some tactics that create large audience growth. I'm dancing carefully around specific wording about that, but there are ways you can increase audience growth honestly, and there are ways that you can increase audience growth perhaps in a way that doesn't have quite such real engagement, and you only have to look at the engagement rates to be able to see what the truth is of that. I think buying audience is not smart, because ultimately you're doomed to fail. Creating content that engages people in a really smart way, and in a really authentic way, that's how you build a real audience. So I want to continue to grow our audiences, but I want to do it in a way that is honest and based on actual relationships. rather than in a way that kind of suggests rapid growth that could then be perhaps questioned by independent observers of that.
So what's the strategy you're looking to employ in order to do that?
It comes down to great content, as I say. It really is about, firstly, have great people working on it. Several years ago in England, I went to a talk by a guy who was a general during Desert Storm. I'm still not entirely sure why I went to go and hear this guy talk, but somebody had told me he was a pretty inspirational guy and he was giving a great talk. And he was talking about his experiences in the Gulf War, and it was pretty emotional. And somebody asked him the question, how do you lead in an environment like that? And he said, it doesn't matter what the environment is. He said, find good people, give them simple instructions, and let them get on with it. And that has resonated with me ever since. When I joined the APP, one of the things that I asked for was the ability to be able to bring in people who had experience and knowledge of working at major league sports level. I think it's our duty to apply those standards to the pros and to the amateurs, and therefore to the content that we create around them, so that video that we put out, graphics we put out, written word that we put out, still photography that we put out would be equally well used by an NFL team or an MLS team or an NBA team, a team that has decades of heritage and operates at the highest level possible in sport. So I was given the green light to be able to do that. We've had a team in place since I started. I think pretty much bar one or two people, we've had exactly the same people in place now for the entire time that I've been with the APP, which I think speaks more to their unerring focus on doing the best possible job they can and being rewarded by what they're doing professionally and personally in seeing the responses that people give to what we put out there. But the strategy is based in great content. Have great people making world-class content that tells stories that people really want to engage with, and then publish them at the right time. Make sure that you are putting them in the hands of people, whether on a phone or on a computer or on a big TV screen, and give them the opportunity to engage with that. It all comes down to really smart people, frankly, people who are much smarter than I am, being able to do their jobs to the best of their abilities. It's interesting because your pod is fail first, and it's something we talk about quite a lot, is not being scared to make mistakes. Everything that you do in marketing is open to criticism from everybody. There are lots of other aspects of a job in an organization like ours or any other organization where if you fail, there may be a small number of people that are going to see you failed. If you fail in social media, it's instantly seen by everybody. And that can be something as small as not getting a period in the right place in a sentence, or spelling something wrong, or getting the wrong photo on a post, for example. People never, 99.9% of the time, they don't say to you, that was perfect. But 100% of the time, they will say, that's wrong. And with the volume of stuff that we're putting out there, we have to be conscious of that and not be afraid to fail. Do it once, learn from it, move on. Do it again, then it becomes a problem. But it's an important part, I think, particularly with creative people, that you allow them to make the occasional mistake, because giving them that freedom will enable them to be able to really express themselves creatively. And ultimately, that serves our purpose.
So often marketing and I'll say creative in general, it's tough to always articulate the ROI or the return on investment sometimes, especially from an organic lens. how are you viewing the return on investment when you're talking about really expanding into these partnerships to grow the APP across social as a whole?
Very good question. And it kind of comes back down to those metrics that we were talking about before. It is expressed, it is measured in are people signing up for our events? Check. Are people coming to watch our events? Check. Are sponsors interested in being part of our organization? Check. Are people tuning in to watch the live stream and the TV? If we can answer those four, then we are achieving what we set out to. It is obviously never as simple as that. We're always working and trying to balance the needs of each one as much as we can. Sponsorship it outweighs everything else in pure financial terms. The time and energy and effort that goes into landing a multi-million-dollar partnership is worth an awful lot more, in a sense, than the same amount of time being applied to get people to sign up for a tournament. But you cannot say, well, therefore we're going to spend 80% of our time going after sponsors, because it'll be to the complete detriment of everything else. So really, the measures of success are we continuing to achieve our goals in each of those areas, and being smart with the way that we deploy resource, budget, and people to be able to meet the needs of each. So a really good example of this is we made a very tough decision a couple of years ago to cut live streaming of the pro game from what had been 4 days down to 2. And we got a huge backlash against that. Lots of people were very upset, players and fans, that we had reduced the amount of opportunity for them to be able to play. To be able to see what players were doing at our events. And we said at the time, we have a finite resource, we have a finite budget, and we have to be able to use that budget in the right way to be able to look at all 4 of those elements that I'm talking about. Now in 2025, because we've been smart with our money, and because we've been really smart with the way that we use our resources, we're putting on bigger and better events. We're now doing live streaming for 4 days of every tournament. And we've added a second live streaming court called the Players Court, which creates even more opportunity for people to be able to see. There are some people who would expect a kind of pat on the back for that would say, that they would feel satisfied from getting kind of like, well, thank you for doing that. I am of the opposite opinion. I think we should be setting the expectation of our fans and our viewers. And we're delivering now on what we said we would a couple of years ago. Some tough decisions have enabled us to continue to be smart about where we are and where we're going, and that's really kind of what it boils down to.
In order to add, because really what I've been walking through is like the revenue streams that are really funneling into the APP as a whole to grow the sport, right, and the brand. Does sports betting play a leg into that when it comes to creating this whole avenue of revenue? Because I feel like every other major professional sport has some sort of sports betting element involved in it.
Very good question, and it speaks to the future of the sport. I think, full disclosure, I have a limited, but I do have a history in the American sports betting world. I've worked for a number of people who are active players in sports betting. So I have a pretty good knowledge of the kind of regulatory framework in which sports betting is taking place in America. It's obviously continuing to grow as more and more states are legalizing sports betting. But fundamentally what it requires is extremely strict governance. You have to have independent rulemaking. You have to have a separation between commercial interests and the governance and regulatory interests of that sport. Without that, there is a fundamental risk of conflict of interest, which means as a bettor, you are being asked to place wagers on games that could be influenced by people who are serving kind of both masters, as it were, both the commercial interests and the regulatory ones. So I think that's why it's so important that the APP has this independent relationship with the USA Pickleball as the governing body of the sport, because it creates, frankly, a fair playing field. The opportunity to introduce sports betting is also going to require a couple of other things to come into the sport, I think. I know it's happened already. There's been some kind of toe in the water exercises with sports betting in pickleball, but I am not surprised it has not been kind of fully embraced by any of the sports books to date, really properly embraced. Partly because of that governance issue, and also I think because of drug testing. I think as the sport looks ahead to an Olympic future, it will have to be signatories to the wider anti-doping code. There are going to have to be processes and procedures in place that are testing athletes. Again, ultimately, that's an important part of the credibility of the sport overall. But from a betting perspective, it means that people are able to place bets within a structured environment. As you say, pretty much every other sport out there has sports betting, but that's because they're well-established sports with all of those frameworks in place. There are a couple of outlier examples where you do have a single entity running all aspects of the sport, but that is not the norm by any stretch. The reality is that you have independence, which creates trust and fairness for sports bettors. So will it be an important part of the future of the game? Absolutely. I think it will. I think it will for a couple of reasons. One is because people like to wager, and they like to wager on something that they feel they have some knowledge of and some understanding of. That is, whether you agree with the moral elements of that or not, from time immemorial, that has been the case, and it's what has fueled sports betting since gladiatorial times, I think, back in the Roman Empire. I think the other element of it is that pickleball has a very interesting opportunity to fill gaps in the sports betting market's windows. Okay, so you think about Monday Night Football, you don't need to have more sport being added to the mix for Monday night, because the betting market is flooded with people who are focused on Monday Night Football. Saturdays and Sundays, you don't need to have sport and another sport adding to the markets. Sure, add it because it doesn't hurt anybody, it doesn't detract. But if you think about a random Thursday morning where you have pros playing on a live stream court from anywhere in the US or potentially anywhere worldwide, that is a down period for sports betting markets, because there's not a lot of other kind of serious level sport taking place. You have tennis, yeah. You have golf, yeah. But pickleball has this opportunity to perhaps even move outside its traditional tournament windows in the future to be able to create markets for the sports betting market. So because you can play pickleball anywhere, anytime, indoors or outdoors, and you could relatively simply apply some production to that to be able to live stream it. Pickleball has this great opportunity to say to the sports betting world, we can give you content that helps in the downtimes of when your audiences are looking for things to go and bet on. So I think that's one of the things that is going to serve pickleball well in the future. But I genuinely believe that there are some serious steps that need to be gone through first for the sport to be able to get to the point where it can credibly enter the sports betting market.
I'm just thinking about this off the top of my head because this is very unique. So I'm thinking through like the average pickleball match being, 15 to 30 minutes, right? Like game. Match is probably a little bit longer, closer to the 30 to 40 minute range. Is there also on the reverse side of that, almost like extending the current sports betting windows where you were putting pickleball before or after a major event like Monday Night Pickleball?
Yeah, I like Monday Night Pickleball. I think that's Steve Kuhn tried that with Tuesday Night Pickleball back in the early days of MLP, and I'm not quite sure what happened to that. But It is flexible. I mean, that is part of the point, right? I mean, is that you could be running pro tournaments or pro events that complement the rest of the sports calendar. I think pickleball has to do that. I think as it continues to grow and develop, to build audience, kind of sitting on the shoulders of giants, as it were, is an important part of is an important way of being able to expose the sport to new audiences. So I think it would benefit. I mean, we're talking about the sports betting market, but it would benefit the sport overall as well. So yeah, I think that the flexibility that the sport offers is potentially a part of this. There's a weird analogy which I'll give you, which again I have some kind of direct experience of, which is in professional darts. So not a sport that too many Americans are heavily engaged with. Back in the 1970s in the UK, darts was a sport played in what's known as working men's clubs and pubs. So it was a blue-collar sport played on the whole by men who like to have a beer, and very, very popular in the UK. They were running these darts tournaments in sort of small to medium-sized venues around the country, and then somebody made a TV show out of one of these darts tournaments, and it drew huge figures. Like they put it on what was then in the UK, you only had 3 terrestrial channels. This is obviously pre-internet and pre-everything else. They put it on at like 10:30 on a Tuesday night on one of those 3 terrestrial channels, and millions of people tuned in. One of the reasons was because a bunch of people were just getting home from the pub and were sitting down at home, turning the TV on, and this game that they had just been playing in the pub is now on TV. And it massively grew. Like, it was the rapid rise of pro darts in the UK, fueled by this TV audience. And suddenly what you had companies who had been advertising on those TV shows, on those TV channels, spending, I'm making these numbers up, but let's say they're spending £100,000, English pounds, British pounds, to advertise for 30-second spots over the course of a year that would have a certain amount of reach and a certain amount of audience engagement. And then what they're being told by this darts tournament is pay us £50,000 and this event will be called Your Brand. So instead of getting kind of fragmented audience engagement through TV ads, they could spend half the money and they could get a massive audience that they could be directly marketed to for the duration of this whole tournament. So this marriage of kind of sponsorship and this nascent sport was enormous. And it created a multi-million pound industry, which continues to grow and thrive today, not just in England, but now worldwide. It's a hugely profitable exercise led by some very smart people who are also involved in boxing and a few other sports. But the point with darts was you could put on a darts tournament anytime, anywhere. So what they would do is go to the sports betting companies and they would say, at the weekends, you're completely full. You have football in England, football, rugby, horse racing, cricket, boxing. You have all these other sports which traditionally take place on Saturdays or Sundays. We'll do darts tournaments from 10 o'clock on a Monday morning to 3 o'clock on a Monday afternoon. We'll televise a darts tournament, and the betting market went mad for them because they filled that window. So pickleball has the same opportunity. It has the opportunity, just like you said, to be able to go to various people who will benefit from this and say, we can fill the gaps in your audience needs by bringing something that is great for you to be able to watch. It has to be well produced, and it has to look great, and it has to have great competition at its heart, because that is the kind of key element of what will bring people to it.
So really, you're solving, if I were to put this in a step-by-step sequence, you're solving the production first here, and longer down the road, you're going to be making that pitch yourself, probably.
No, much better people than I do. As a Brit, I'm generally greeted with kind of this slight look of confusion. I'm very used to it now. It's a kind of, hey, hang on, he's speaking the same language, but he doesn't quite sound like us. So I let much cleverer people than me do that sort of thing.
So the other piece of this that kind of like jumped into my mind as we were talking is, are you looking at other sports? Let's say it's golf. Let's say it is tennis correlation, right? Are you looking to see what audiences from those sports are also participating in pickleball and finding a ways to almost align them maybe with the off season of those sports in a way to increase viewership? Like, is there strategy there?
Yeah, I think that's a very smart way of looking at it. Complementing rather than competing with other sports, I think is a key part to the growth of the game. There is a little bit of kind of cat and mouse with that, by which I mean you don't want to be beholden to other sports for too long. As pickleball, the pro level of the game continues to increase and audience numbers continue to grow. You don't want to find yourself in a position where you've been kind of the nice partner and then suddenly you're in a position to say, actually, we don't need you anymore. But I think that is an important part of it. I think it's also there's a broader piece to this, which is about putting programming out at times that people really want to be able to engage with it. But also being realistic about what that audience is actually going to be at the end of it. There is a ceiling to any audience that you're going to be able to engage, and I think you have to look at what that ceiling actually is, and that gives you the kind of target goal. That gives you where you should be aspiring to. That could be millions, but it might not be. I mean, it could be hundreds of millions, but it might not be. But you have to have, I think, a realistic expectation or a realistic understanding of what the audience actually is. I think if you put all of your eggs into one basket, you are at risk of missing the opportunities that pickleball can provide businesses for the long term.
So for any of my entrepreneurs that are listening, right, or if it is other creators or influencers, what are some of the correlations that you're seeing with those audiences from either other sports or other areas that are also participating in pickleball? Because, when you go and market, you're like trying to cross-reference groups of people, etc. So what are you seeing on your end?
So there's a couple of things that I'm seeing which I think are really important here. One is have a clear sense of what your audience wants. There are some very successful people in the pickleball world who have a single message, and it's this is how to improve your serve, or this is how to improve your backhand. They have no interest in talking about pros. They have no interest in talking about where to go and play, where to go and find a great game of pickleball. They're just doing one thing and they're doing it really well. That's true of all social. Right. I mean, that's true. People who have a kind of singular vision of what they're trying to talk about, build loyalty, build an audience. There's a chef that I follow on Insta called Sad Pappy, who's this like deeply cool chef guy covered in tattoos. He cooks with a hoodie on and a cap on all the time. The guy he rips a kitchen. He's a monster. I follow him because he makes really good cooking content. I would never presume to call myself a chef. I think anybody that doesn't work the line in a kitchen that calls themselves a chef of any description is perhaps missing the point about what being a chef is actually about. But as a kind of wannabe cook, I follow him because he puts out really authentic, engaging content about one subject. So I think one of the things that I would say is know your lane and become a master at it. If you do that, you will build a loyal and engaged following. There is a risk, I think, with pickleball that you get entranced by the pro piece. I think there is a risk that you kind of think that is it. Nothing else matters because that is where the rewards lie. If you're a pro player, you have to be focused on that. And again, it's why we focus so hard on creating a really truly competitive environment for those pros to go and earn points, to go and win prize money. But if you are somebody who is involved in the pickleball world, don't try and be all things to all people. Have a very singular vision of what is going to create success for you. So whether that means you're a creator who is starting out to build an audience online, you're the perfect example. You have an amazing and burgeoning pickleball story that is being added to every single time you pick up a paddle, but you're doing it under the banner of fail first. So you have a very singular vision of what the vehicle is that's going to carry you to success. That's the model. Like that is the way that people should be thinking about these kind of things. And I think one of the things with pickleball is it's still so much in its infancy in so many ways. It's very easy to get attracted by the kind of the latest shiny object. Whether it's a brand new paddle that's suddenly come out, or paddle technology, and you kind of going to want to go and talk about that for 5 minutes, or whether it's ball and what's the best ball. If you're going to do products, do products. If you're going to do tips and tricks, do tips and tricks. If you're going to do fashion, do fashion. They may not tap into what some people are obsessed with, but that's how you will build a truly authentic, engaged, loyal audience.
This is kind of a perfect setup for my follow-up question here, which is, we've talked heavily about like storytelling and really how much that impacts a brand as a whole. Such a key element of that is like building these stories around the players, right? And what they're going through, what their lives are like, etc. What is the APP really trying to do in order to assist these players to really build their personal brands just beyond being a pro player?
There's I always do this. There's two answers to that. I'll start with the pro one, and then I'll talk about the amateur one, because that's important as well. One of our team is a very talented person called Deborah Liu. Deborah it does all sorts of bits of work for our website and various other things. If you tune in to our social channels, you will see Deborah fronting a series that started out life as Off the Court and has recently changed names to Pickleball Stories, presented by AARP. And by the time this comes out, we may have kind of renamed that a little bit. But the whole point with that is Deborah has built incredibly good relationships with a whole bunch of pros who are playing regularly on the APP tour. She features them in blogs and in lots of kind of written word pieces on the website, which are linked into social, and photos and videos that we create. But Deborah came to me a while ago and said, how can we increase the spotlight on pros? What can we do to be able to show who they are on and off court? They get great exposure on the TV because they're on the live stream. If they've got themselves into higher stages of competition and they're on championship court, they're getting some exposure on that. But this is a little kind of overly simplified, but we literally, Deborah takes them off the court and we find out who these players are. We find out what motivates them. We find out what their stories are. That is a hugely valuable exercise for us. It means we can create hero figures out of the players that you only really see competing. It's part and parcel of how you build stars in the sport. Is the stars on the field of play, as it were, on the court, because they're getting to the latter stages of competition. But then you only ever really hear from them at the end of it when they've won a medal and they're talking slightly breathlessly, or they're talking about what they've just done, thanking sponsors, and then they move on. Being able to dedicate the time and resource to taking that player away from competition and finding out what makes them tick is very, very important for us. It's also important for the player, because it means the player is getting featured content that they can then share. They can go to their sponsors. They can share through their own channels. And it is content that is produced at the highest possible level. Again, back to the kind of fundamental point. The goal with that is to create something that would sit equally well in an NFL show as it does in a APP pickleball show. So that's one of the ways that we invest in player content to help build them and increase their profile and increase the fans' understanding of who they are. As I say, Deborah also does a whole bunch of other pieces of player content, from a player-focused blog at each tournament to loads of other bits and pieces that we do between events. Another person who is kind of synonymous with our tournaments is a woman called Jade Mallard, who runs our social media. And Jade is constantly running around tournaments, creating bits of content that go on TikTok and go on Reels and all sorts of other places. So she is also finding ways of being able to showcase players in some of that perhaps more kind of bite-sized content that people are interacting with in the same way that we all do when we're scrolling through our phones. So, that's the kind of tip of the spear. But you think about how much work and energy goes into planning that, producing that, executing it, publishing it at the right time, and then engaging with it once it's out there. So that's the pros. And then I mentioned this Pickleball Stories presented by AARP. That is something that started for us a couple of years ago. What we wanted to do was find people whose lives had been positively impacted by this amazing sport. And we wanted to create an opportunity to tell their stories. And we've been really privileged to have a whole bunch of people that you can find on our YouTube channel whose stories have been featured by us. And there is the unifying thread of pickleball. I go back to what I said much earlier about tribes. There is a gentleman down in Hilton Head, Scott Ryder, who, if Scott's watching this, I owe you a call. I'm really sorry, Scott. Haven't got around to calling you for months, and I feel very bad about that. Scott has Parkinson's, and when he picks up a paddle, his Parkinson's almost disappears. He delights in telling his opponents, like he says, I watch them and they see me as I'm walking up and they think, oh, I'm going to destroy this guy. And then he picks up a paddle and he is a monster on the court. He explained to me, pickleball has a hugely positive effect on people with Parkinson's. It has a direct positive medical scientific effect. It has a positive impact on cognitive behavior and on physical behavior. It's physical exercise, the hand-to-eye coordination required of pickleball. There is a direct link between playing pickleball and having a better life for somebody with Parkinson's. So we sent a couple of people down to go and shoot some stories with Scott. We put them out on our channels, and that is how we tell the stories of people who are involved in this sport. It would be kind of easy to get sidetracked into a medical thing with that, because there's lots of people whose lives have been positively impacted in many other ways than just kind of medically. But again, it's investment and it's a huge amount of planning and exercise to be able to get to the point where you publish something that is worthy of any major league brand out there. And that's how we kind of divide our attention. It's pros and it's everybody else.
So if I'm thinking from like a leverageability standpoint, almost like a secondary or tertiary effect here, by you elevating the personal brand of the players, the likelihood that sponsors are going to actually want to work with them is higher. And therefore the incentive for the players to want to participate and consistently play on the APP tour beyond just the actual prize winnings is that much greater. Am I kind of framing that?
100%. Okay. Yeah. And I've used the term duty of care. We have a duty of care to the players to create the best possible competition environment for them so that they can go out and showcase how good they are as an athlete. And then we have a duty of care to be able to kind of wrap around that the opportunity to share their stories. We have a relatively simple mantra, is if you win on the court, you'll win off the court, because we will find ways of being able to share your stories. And and that there are more and more players coming through the system now for us because there is such demand to come and compete in APP events that we find more and more of those amazing stories to be able to tell and share.
So the general subject that I want to close with here is, I think, the one that is consistently on our entire audience's mind when it comes to pickleball, and it's how the hell do we get it into the Olympics, and what the hell is holding us back from it, right? So from your perspective, what is currently holding us back from getting pickleball into the Olympics?
So there's a couple of things there's that I would say. One is it won't be in LA 2028. So people who are suggesting that it could be there, it's not going to happen because
You got
LA
people crying in their living room right now.
Yeah, so I think that was set in stone some years ago. So it's unfortunate, but the Olympics will be back in America before you know it. So there will be an opportunity for this American-born sports to be showcased at the Olympic level in America. What does it need? So there are some basic kind of Olympic charter needs. One of them is how many countries are playing the sport. How many countries have kind of organized associations and federations with men playing and women playing. I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head. I was debating whether I should try and Google it while we're talking, but you would see my eyes glaze over and I would lose my train of thought. But so there is a kind of numerical target, which is number of countries playing the sport for men and for women. The second thing is a kind of unified set of rules and regulations worldwide. So there needs to be one set of rules for scoring, and I know that's obviously a hot topic amongst pickleball players, but there needs to be a very just one set of regulations. There needs to be independent governance of the sport. You cannot have players making their own line calls, for example. Which is why kind of having independent referees is such an important part of our organisation, because it means that there is independence and objectivity of governance, and you are going to need to have doping controls in place for the sport to be able to be to be transparent at the highest level. Are we close to it for 2032? I'm not entirely sure. Some of my colleagues believe that the sport is in with a shot of achieving that. I personally, this is not an APP view. This is my view. I think more likely 2036, because I think to get to the kind of regulatory piece is going to require quite a lot of kind of collaboration amongst some people who are having interesting but maybe slightly opposed conversations at the moment. And I think the doping piece, that costs money. That's a significant amount of investment. You think about it just in the USA, for USADA to be engaged with the pro game requires out of competition random testing. It requires having testing at events. There's a significant amount of spend that is required to be able to achieve that. But it has to be there to get into the Olympics. I think one of the most amazing things about pickleball is, and I can say this as an Englishman living in America, is there isn't another sport that America has given the world that will get into the Olympics one day. You think about this sport born up on the on the West Coast back in the 60s. And now played by millions of Americans and now being picked up by people worldwide. The NFL has been embraced internationally as a viewing sport. American football is not a mass participation sport in the rest of the world. Baseball, has a limited audience outside the USA. Basketball has a high audience and has a lot of people playing it, but it is not a kind of mass participation sport in the way that pickleball is. What other sport born in America has been given to the rest of the world? I genuinely can't think of anything else. So it's American born and bred, and it will one day feature in the Olympics. the tough bit for Americans is going to be finding out there's a whole bunch of people out there who are as good at the game as Americans are, which is why it's so important to us to send our national team, APP national team members, out to the international competitions, because they're saying, look at the standard that we're playing at. We ran our first APP Atlantic Cup in Miami last year. That was a tournament that featured Team USA versus Team Europe. It was a group of players from our APP Next Gen group who competed against some great people coming over from Europe. Honestly, there was an expectation, I think, of maybe a belief that Team USA versus Team Europe would be pretty easy for Team USA. And they got a very rude awakening. It was an amazing competition. It went down to literally the last ball of the final game. Team Europe were fantastic, like great competitors, great people, really good spirit, but really good at the game. And I think there were a number of people who were involved with that who were kind of going, wow, they've caught up. So will it be an Olympic sport? Yes, it will. It needs to get these regulatory pieces in place. It needs to get doping controls in place. It needs a few more countries to kind of officialize the sport as national federations. And it needs a single entity on the global level controlling the sport worldwide. And then I think it has a realistic shot of getting into the Olympics. Possibly for 2032, maybe more likely for 2036. That's only my view, though.
Does that regulating body, that separate entity, need to be something brand new, or is that something that you believe the current tours can probably establish or unify under one branch?
I mean, both are possible. I think that there is an element of control that is going to be an interesting topic of discussion for those who want to operate at the truly global level. That's kind of what I mean about America finding out that the rest of the world is caught up. What is perceived at the moment as being the big player in all of this may not be the case in a year, may not be the case in 4 years' time. Can tours work together? We would always say yes, because we have an entirely inclusive, open approach. Our doors are open to anybody who wants to come and be part of our world. I can't speak for the others, but I know that there are certain restrictions on who can compete in some other tournaments. Does that translate onto the world stage? Perhaps. But I think it's more likely that there has to be collaboration rather than kind of control in order to establish a single unifying body that represents the interests of all the federations worldwide. There really isn't another credible sport out there that has multiple international governing bodies that compete for space with each other. You have FIFA in soccer. You have UEFA for the European soccer, but FIFA is the kind of world governing body. You have the International Cricket Council. I know cricket doesn't mean an enormous amount to a lot of American audiences, but it is, I think, one of the top 3 sports worldwide because of, largely driven by Indian market and Commonwealth markets. You have single entity in tennis, you have a single entity in rugby, you have a single entity in motor racing, the FIA. So, you take all of those kind of well-established, long-running sports. Track and field, has a single entity running it internationally. The FIS, the International Ski Federation, runs all ski and snowboard sports worldwide. So, yeah, one single entity, and I think that in order to achieve that, it's going to probably require some people to say we'd like to work together rather than we'd like to control.
So the reason that I'm asking that a little bit is because you're right. The evidence leans in the other direction when it comes to other sports. The other piece of that is that the past couple of years they've had the Pickleball World Cup event, And from a energy for your country standpoint, it was electric, right? There was a bunch of highlights from it. But obviously, when you get to the exclusive model, a lot of players couldn't play in it on one half of it because one, either there was other tournaments going on, or two, they weren't allowed to play based off contractual purposes. But would you say in the meantime, for us to kind of elevate it on that global scale, we would need something like the Pickleball World Cup as in comparison to FIFA to really grow it from a country to country standpoint rather than waiting so long to get it into the Olympics? Is there a place for something like a World Cup to really thrive?
I think an open World Cup, yes, absolutely. One where any player can compete at any time. And I think in reality, that's probably where the sport has to go. The idea about trying to restrict freedom of movement of players, it may seem to serve short-term needs, but ultimately, I think that is restrictive practice that or could be viewed as restrictive practice that could be limiting growth. I think there's an important point around this, with particularly from an American perspective, which is as an English person, I have regular opportunities to support my country in international sport. When the England football team plays in European Championships or in the World Cup, and that is a cycle that's constantly going on, whether it's the tournament itself or whether it's qualifying games for those tournaments. So I can put an England jersey on and watch an England international and forget my club allegiances, forget my, you could almost say tour allegiances, but forget my club allegiances. It's about the country. I have the same with rugby. I have the same with cricket. And those are kind of three of the biggest sports in the world. I then have the Olympics. America doesn't really do that, weirdly. America gets behind Team USA during the Olympic cycles in an amazing way. And I've been part of that, both in the Summer Olympics and the Winter Olympics. So I've worked with Team USA at the Winter Olympics in Pyeongchang in 2018. So I've seen just how Olympic fever works. Americans love Team USA, and they're right behind it. The day that the Winter Olympics finished, everyone's forgotten about Team USA. And I mean that with all respect to my friends at the US Olympic and Paralympic Committee. But they're then working on the next Olympic cycle. The NFL doesn't compete internationally. You don't have like a World Football Cup. You don't have, I with great respect, the World Series of Baseball doesn't play in Germany or in France or in India. So you don't have Americans having the opportunity to take off their Cubs jersey, shirt, and put on a USA jersey. 2026, you will have that here because you will have the FIFA World Cup coming to America, Mexico, and Canada. And I'm really interested to see how much the country gets behind the US men's national team during that tournament. If they get to the latter stages of the tournament, I could see national fever starting to really take root here. And I think that could be fascinating. America doesn't really compete, outside the Olympics and outside football, what I call football, soccer. You don't have this regular opportunity, almost monthly opportunity, to kind of express national pride on the international sports stage. The women's national team, the soccer team, has been the dominant team in women's soccer for years, and absolutely sets the standard. Perhaps not quite so much most recently, but has been one of the world's greatest sports teams ever. And it was interesting to me living in Austin when the Women's World Cup was on to see soccer fans in Austin getting right behind the women's national team. So they fans of EPL teams, fans of MLS teams, getting very excited about wearing an American soccer jersey. How does that translate to your idea about Pickleball World Cup? I imagine if I was an English person having that conversation, I would say it's an absolute no-brainer because we're already doing it. Like we do it with all these other sports. And I get to enjoy supporting a club or a team that I like in football, rugby, cricket, or anything else, and I get to celebrate national pride when my country represents me at the national level. I don't think the psyche is the same in America. I don't think people are quite as motivated by the same desire to want to compete at the national level. That's not to say that people don't want to represent their country, because I know that they do. And pride in the American flag and in this great country, it's way bigger than anything I've ever experienced as an English person. The love of this country is amazing. So, but I just don't know that the answer to your question can be best answered by an English person, because I have a biased view of it, which is, yeah, you've got to do that. You absolutely have to do that. And it has to be open. Ask an American who perhaps hasn't grown up with the same kind of like mindset of, obviously I'm into my sport, but I'm also into it at the international level. And I think that's a huge opportunity for us to be able to kind of build on that. So that's a very long-winded amateur description of American national sport, but I think perhaps is why it hasn't yet really been seized upon, but could be. But it has to be open. That's critical.
So we have our final two questions here, our closing questions that every guest has to answer. So for you, it's, what is one failure with the APP that you're thankful for today?
One failure with the APP. I'm a PR person, so you would expect me to answer this.
I already know.
Answer this in another way. There is a perception that the APP failed to join the fight for pro contracts. There is still commentary online occasionally about what went on with the kind of tour wars and how we had maybe not been part of that. Some perceive that as a failure. Some could perceive that as a failure. I think in the long run, that's going to be proven to be the best decision that we've ever made, because it enabled us to focus on competition rather than kind of exhibition, and it enabled us to be able to use our finite resources in a way that would enable us to build a sustainable long-term business, one that attracts sponsors and fans and people like that. So that's a very PR answer to your question, but I think it speaks to one of the perhaps misconceptions about our organization from a very small group of people who are very interested in the pro game. And I understand why they are, because it's fascinating and it's on TV and on live stream, and it's attracted some interesting names and all that kind of stuff. But I think in the long run that it will be seen as the smart decision to have not put a lot of money into contractual relationships with players, money that is not being repaid in financial terms by revenues generated by the sport. It's a gamble on one sector of the sport being the most important, most valuable sector of the sport. And as we've touched on throughout this, pickleball is being driven by millions of people who are playing for lots of different reasons, but the bulk of them are people that just want to play the sport to have fun. And that is slightly at odds with the idea of kind of ownership of one segment of that. I'll give you a personal one, which is there have been events that I've been part of where I wish we had done an even better job of being able to showcase the pros at the right level. What I mean by that is I think TV flattens the game to some extent.
Agreed.
I think people tuning in to watch pickleball are seeing something on TV that doesn't quite look as far ahead as their game as it does when they watch golf or when they watch running or when they watch anything else they're tuning in to watch on TV. I think that they're seeing a sport being played out that they think, I could do that. And whether they can or not, the reality is most of them couldn't. But whether they can or not, I think that means that the TV flattens it. So we've invested very heavily in TV production. I am constantly pushing for us to invest more, because I think that we need to do an even bigger, better job of showcasing what supreme athletes these players are at that level. Their health is extraordinary. Their cardio ability is extraordinary. Their strength is extraordinary. I've worked with athletes in all sorts of different sports, and I would put pro pickleball players up alongside any other, famous or non-famous high-level athlete. Their hand-to-eye coordination, their reaction time, their speed is outlandish. You see the interaction on court. You see the rhythm go from slow to super fast to those kind of firefights that you see. It's extraordinary, and it's a wow moment for anybody who comes and watches the sport for the first time. I don't think we've failed them as such, because I think that's probably a strong negative for it. But I would like us to be able to do an even bigger, better job of being able to show off what amazing athletes these guys are on TV. We're doing the best job in the business at that at the moment, but we can only improve.
A piece of that, I was thinking back to when I was down there with Ken, a piece of that absolutely being that stadium court, that center court at the Fort, which is going to be super, super cool to see in the upcoming months, right?
Yeah. So that stadium court at the Fort, I'm glad you mentioned that. My friends at the Fort would be disappointed if I didn't mention them. When I was helping Steve and Brooks and those folks launch MLP, one of the things that struck me was we built a stadium court at Dreamland in Dripping Springs in Texas, at Steve's old facility there. We built that court in the middle, in a covered section, and we put some bleachers in. We built the court. It was as good as it could be for the time. And I remember leaving that event thinking, somebody's going to build the Wimbledon of pickleball. And I selfishly, I was thinking, I wonder who I know who would invest in that. The Fort is that. The Fort is what pickleball has needed. It is the Flushing Meadows. It is the Augusta. It is the jewel in the crown of the sport. It is what the sport needs to be able to go to the next level. It needs a great facility that amateurs and pros can play at and compete at, day in, day out. But it needs that showpiece, and that stadium is it. And when it opens, it is going to be a game changer for the sport, because it is a permanent home for the APP. It is a permanent home for the best players in the world, and it'll have that aura about it that you get from any sports venue that you go to. The Brad Tuckman and Rich and the guys at the Fort who are behind that facility are very smart, extremely hardworking, dedicated people who had an amazing vision of what they wanted to achieve. And they are going to reset expectations for this sport as when that stadium opens. It's a true game changer.
Is it for our audiences on track end of March or beginning of April when the tour will be back at the Fort?
I would let Brad and Rich answer that question. Those guys are working so hard. It's worth bearing in mind. We took a tournament there with 1,200 players at the end of January to a facility that remains under construction. So you're trying to build this world-class facility, and then you get 1,200 people arriving for a week of a televised tournament. So they had to deal with that. It's tough enough bringing a tournament to a venue, let alone one that remains under construction. So I would, you will speak to them on this pod at some point. If you haven't already, you will be in touch with them, and you'll be able to feature what they're going to do down there. And when it opens, it's going to be jaw dropping. When they launched that, the social media coverage of that and the earned media coverage of that, it was bigger than anything pickleball's ever seen.
Oh
You know, it
yeah.
was being picked up by media worldwide as, look at this. Look at this amazing facility. And that was renderings. Imagine what it's going to be like when we can fly a drone through it and we can show off what it looks like as the sun's rising over it or the sun setting over it. And as you hear the pop pop on that stadium court, guys, yeah, we're all very, very excited about that.
That's what I'm excited for, that before and after of when I was down there, because it was pretty heavily under construction still when I was down there. So that before and after of where it was to where it is now is going to be super unique. So our last question for you. What is your greatest fear moving forward?
My greatest fear is that the plane that I'm flying on falls out of the sky.
A lot of people's fears right now.
No, I would genuinely. I mean, I've spent enough time in planes over my life. Traveling in Formula One for 15-ish years means you spend a lot of time in planes, and I never had a problem with it. Since I've had kids, that seems to have changed. My greatest fear is nothing related to work. My greatest fear is genuinely that I don't have the time to appreciate my children and my wife. I love what I do for work. I'm extremely honoured to work with an amazing organisation with really good people who, as I said at the top of this, are grounded in good morals, good ethics. But I think that life boils down to three things for me. Do you like the house that you live in? Are you surrounded by family and friends that you love and care about? And do you like what you do for work? I love what I do for work. I have an amazing house that's full of love. And I have the two best children in the world. And I have an amazing, talented, smart wife who's way cleverer than me and much a better person than me. So at the moment, I get to check all three boxes. My biggest fear is that one or all of those drops. And I'm doing everything I can to try and stop that happening.
So I have a bonus question for you. I did say that was the last one, but you got a bonus one. Because I've asked this a couple of times and the answers are very unique. And I feel like it will be also very unique to you. So if someone were to write a book on your life, what would you want the last chapter to say and why?
There was a turning point in my life. I had an idyllic childhood until I was 13. And then I was sent off to boarding school in England in the mid-'80s, which was a slightly weird experience. It was a very strange school. My life was kind of pretty predetermined until that point, and a very classic kind of English like schooling plan. You know, the plan would have been go to university, get a kind of profession, join either the armed forces or get a profession, be a lawyer or a doctor. I was never going to be a doctor, but you know, do something kind of normal. And then at 13, I went to this school that was a very strange experience. And my parents split up and my kind of whole world kind of blew up around me. And quite often I've felt like I am trying to kind of recapture what life was like before these kind of life-changing moment that happened when I was 13. So what would be the last chapter? The last chapter would be about how my story has come full circle. And what I've been able to create is a world for my children that is as happy as the world that I lived in until the decision was made to send me off to boarding school. And I don't blame anybody for that. And I've made the best of it since then. And I think I've done in some ways okay with certain bits of my life since then. But I'd like the last chapter to be that I learned a lesson from that and that I created the opportunity for my children to be the best versions of themselves that they can be, while surrounded by happiness and love for their entire lives.
Well, Tom, thank you so much for joining us today on the pod. I hope that you had as much fun as I did. I definitely enjoyed our conversation today, and there's there's so much insight into there, not only to the pickleball space, but also beyond that, just from a marketing lens. We definitely dove into some key things that I think people will be able to take away and apply pretty quickly to their general brands or applications. And I hope that we could have you on for another episode to dive more into that personal stuff that you grew up navigating, and really all of the adversity that you're able to get through in order to get to where you are today. So we'll definitely have to have you back on for an episode 2 for sure.
I'd love to, mate. Let me say, I wholeheartedly applaud what you do. I meet quite a lot of people who have kind of visions of where they want to go with certain things, but what you're doing is being done with a smile on your face and a sense of positivity that is rarely seen in many other people. So I take my hat off to you for doing great things and doing it with a really good energy. So thank you for letting me talk about the APP and about myself for a little bit. And I'd love to be back on. More power to you. Keep going, brother.
Thank you, Tom.